Good evening, everyone. My name is Gabriel Meyer, the Executive Director of the historic Ruskin Art Club of Los Angeles. You can find out all about us on our website, www.ruskinartclub.org. Tonight, I have the pleasure of introducing an old friend and an old friend of the Ruskin Art Club, Andre Chaves, founder of Clinker Press, once in nearby Pasadena, but now relocated to Tualatin, Oregon, near Portland. Just pause a moment while I admit someone. While we had to whittle down Andre's bio for reasons of space in our publicity, there's no reason why Andre can't have the unedited treatment now. So by way of introduction, permit me to read Andre's fuller biography. Andre Chaves was born in Brazil, far away from the world of arts and crafts and fine printing. Luck would have it that upon receiving a scholarship from the American Field Service Exchange student program, he was selected to spend a year with a family in East Aurora, New York, home of the Roycrofters. In 1966, however, was the nadir of interest in the arts and crafts movement, so no real contact occurred. The Roycroft Inn was just a restaurant in town. Of course, now the Roycroft campus is a vital organization devoted to both the memory of arts and crafts and to new work. Returning to Brazil, he completed his studies in medicine and returned to Baltimore, Maryland for his residency, and then to Miami for a fellowship in hand surgery. As it happened, he had met, fell in love, and eventually married Anne, who was a student during his East Aurora high school year stint. The couple moved to Los Angeles and then settled in Pasadena. The contact with arts and crafts happened accidentally in the early 80s when they mistook a light finished pane chair for the in-fashion Scandinavian furniture. The antique store owner, Gary Booth, gave them the first lesson in the definition of the various stickleys and mentioned something about the Green brothers. Surprisingly, Roycroft was not initially mentioned. By the seat of their pants, they designed and built a home in the vicinity of Pasadena, but in the late 80s bought the Duncan Irwin House, designed by the Green brothers, and went deep into the arts and crafts world. They lived there for 10 years, during which time, instigated by Peter Hay, owner of Book Alley Bookshop, started a printing group. Since they had nowhere to put the presses, Andre offered the garage of his house, decoratively constructed with the overfired bricks known as Clinker bricks. The name seemed appropriate for his press, subsequently known as the Clinker Press. The association with the Zamorano Club and his ongoing interest in books led to the continuing efforts in the printing shop, helped by Regis Grade, a private printer himself, and Bob Paduano, a press repairman, who became a friend and was responsible for the acquisition of many printing items. The Clinker Press, which continues to operate today, focuses on the printing of books and broadsides mostly related to the arts and crafts movement. The press has grown considerably since that time, and after 4 moves, is now located in Tualatin, Oregon, just south of Portland. Andre developed a deep interest in the history of printing, as well as the arts and crafts movement, sometimes taking what he calls a rather challenging approach to the accepted concepts. He has spoken many times at the Arts and Crafts Conference in Asheville, North Carolina, and about printing to the Double Crown Club in London and the Alcuin Society in Canada, to name just a few. He says, his ideas may not always conform to the standard view of either subject, but that makes it only the more interesting. Andre is going to do a wide-ranging presentation for us tonight, rubbing shoulders with the private press movement, the Clinker press. He will do a lecture and then give us a video tour of his printing studio. That lecture, by the way, will also be incorporated in a video, after which he will be on hand for questions, comments, and our always lively discussion. So let's get started.
Well, good evening to all of you Zoomers. I don't know who you are, but I'm glad you came tonight, and I hope you enjoyed this short trip through this view of the printing world. I would like to start by thanking Gabriel and the Ruskin Art Club for asking me to speak about a subject that is so dear to me, and it's been interesting preparing this presentation as it forced me to look at it from the Gestalt perspective. And just for fun, I have included a few slides that are not about my printing specifically, but are still related to printing. Many are from my own collection, and I hope Morris' expression doesn't mean that he's not happy with my lecture. But let me start with this. There is something presumptuous about me speaking of the Clinker press in the same breath as Morris' Kelmscott press. The disproportion between the two is enormous, and I want you to have always that in mind during this talk. Even if what we do as letterpress printers have some practical similarities, the historical time in which the original private press movement existed can no longer be reproduced at the present time. What happened did happen in a time and reality that cannot be reconstructed today. This quotation from Nietzsche reflects exactly what I have in mind. Quote, "There are people who are so presumptuous that they know of no other way to praise a greatness that they publicly admire than by representing it as a preliminary stage and bridge leading to themselves." I mentioned the historical time, and I have a few things specifically in mind regarding the historical timing. Initially because there was a man in the mid-1700s who designed and cast his own typeface when printers in general relied on typecutters for the job. His name was John Baskerville, and his typeface is still widely used today. He printed pretty much what he wanted, and with his knowledge of the Japanning technique, that's the European versions of lacquer work, which was his profession, by the way, he improved the quality of the ink so that it was a little brighter on the page, then worked with the famous James Whatman to revive the wove paper as opposed to laid paper. Wove paper was developed in China, as we all know, and the molds were made of bamboo, leaving no mark on the paper. When the technique arrived in Spain and Italy from the Middle East in the 15th century, the molds were made with fine wires, leaving traces of it on the paper, and that became known as laid paper. And here is my paper-making screen for laid paper. It was from a British company in the mid-1800s. Yet, with all of that, he was the right person at the wrong time. His typeface was criticized, and he had no followers, and even had difficulty selling the large amount of type and punches used for his work. No one in England wanted it, and eventually his wife sold it in France after his death. And by the way, Baskerville was the first printer to use Arabic numerals in some of his publications. And just a little later, in the 1700s, another approach to private press was attempted by Horace Walpole and his Strawberry Hill Press, again with not a lot of success. It was more the work of vanity than quality or originality, in addition to having no ultimate goals. And about 40 years before Morris, Charles Daniel, as a schoolboy, began to be interested in printing, and using a small press began to print cards and small books. As you can see in the example in the middle, the printing then was not very good. Daniel is well known for having used the fell types, hidden at the Oxford University Press for years, but not used by them as it was considered old-fashioned. Again, he was not influential as he did not have an agenda or a recognizable style. But he persevered and eventually bought an Albion press and began to print his small books with better quality. This is an example of one of the most desirable books from the Daniel Press, The Garland of Rachel. His Albion press was eventually donated to the Bodleian Library after his death. The more current concept of a private press was reapproached, particularly in London in the late 1800s, as a reaction to the commercial printing that was being done at that time. The reason was not lack of knowledge or technique, but carelessness due to the dramatic increase in demand for printing material, both books, art prints, and photography. This created the need to increase the speed away from the old-fashioned hand typesetting to the automatic composing machines. But even then, it still requires that the type be put back in a machine by hand. You may know that Mark Twain lost a huge amount of money in one of these composing machines. But Ottmar Mergenthaler was the one who revolutionized the industry by inventing a machine that would cast not individual type, but the entire line of letters and then redistribute the matrices. The machine created was the linotype. And the increased demand for paper forced the industry to progressively rely on pulp paper from trees instead of the more expensive cotton or linen paper, by then no longer made by hand, but by the cylinder-powered machine, the Fourdrinier. And aesthetically, the unimaginative page design with multiple typefaces, Roman, italic, bold, extended, or condensed in various sizes, was the norm. And the use of talc to artificially thicken the ink caused it to fade in time. And this all powered by progressively faster printing presses. All of that led to simultaneous increase in output and a decrease in the quality of available products. And Morris was not alone in criticizing the industry. William Morris looked at those books and compared them with the early printed books that he collected, the so-called incunabula, books printed before the 1500s. Admiring them, he felt that something should be done to improve the quality of printing. In a somewhat exaggerated fashion, he stated that after Gutenberg, printing went progressively downhill. Then, during the early stages of the formation of the Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society, the precursor to the Arts and Crafts movement, Emery Walker gave a lecture in 1893 showing type augmented visually using the then modern lantern slides, which allowed Morris to see the letters in detail. After the lecture, in this very abbreviated history, he told Walker that he had decided to design his own typeface and start printing. But Walker was not a letterpress printer, but rather a process printer, a printer of pictures, as in this book by Alan Crawford I printed long ago. But obviously he knew letterpress technique. And this, just out of curiosity, I found this large wood sign years ago at the Rose Bowl Flea Market in Pasadena. It was very well done, except for the color, and I did improve it a bit. The guy didn't have any idea what Kelmscott was about, and didn't know that the design was a Morris wallpaper design called Strawberry Thieves. It's currently hanging at the printing shop. Morris rules, as the license plate says, and this presentation could be entirely on Morris, but I will try not to let it be so. It's just that he was such a huge figure that hagiography is frequently used to depict him, with critics always accused of sour grapes. For those too young to remember, the car is a Morris Minor. And Samuel Butler famously said, "God cannot change the past, historians can." With this, I mean that historians take the more as they desire in order to prove their point. Mostly, they want to talk of More as the printer, the poet, the beautiful decorator, and the pattern designer, but not the More's owner of the highly polluting copper mines that he inherited from his father, which helped finance his various endeavors through his life. He was even the director of the mines for several years. But here are some facts. He had no training in type design. It was only with Emery Walker's help up front and the experienced punch cutter Edward Prince at the end that successful could possibly be achieved in his designing a new version of Jensen's typeface in 1890. He became known as the Golden Type, used for his book The Golden Legend. And this led Cobden Sanderson of Dove's Press, St. John Hornby of Ashendene Press, and C.R. Ashby of Essex House Press, among others, all of them wealthy, none of them type designers, to go ahead and design their own typeface and print their own books with the help of Emery Walker. All of this happened after the death of Morris. Conveniently, Lynn Boyd Benton, founder of ATF, American Type Founders, invented a pantograph specifically to facilitate the making of typefaces in 1884. I don't have any evidence that it was used by them, but it's possible. It was certainly used extensively in this country. It may surprise you to know that the original pantograph was invented in the 1600s. Morris, who did call himself a decorator, was very careful to choose his printer and block cutter, William Hooper, as well as select the best paper from Joseph Batchelor, and finding no suitable black ink in England, he imported it from Germany. I want to make it clear that neither Morris nor all of those mentioned were printers themselves. They were really publishers. And here is a beautifully calligraphic quote from Morris that proves the point. Quote, "Pleased as I am with my printing, when I saw my two men at work on the press yesterday with their sticky printer's ink, I couldn't help lamenting the simplicity of the scribes and his desk and his black ink and his blue and red ink, and I almost felt ashamed of my press after all." Close quote. And here is my example of a sheet of the kind of Batchelor handmade paper used at the Kelmscott Press. Then one day I was put together with this guy who had two type cabinets with these beautiful pulls, and I was told he had a typeface called Satan. I had never heard of this before, but I was intrigued by the cabinets and went ahead and bought the cabinets. When I looked inside, I recognized the type as Morris's Troy and Chaucer type. I later investigated and found that ATF went to talk to Morris to be allowed to reproduce his typeface in various sizes with Benton's pantograph. Morris essentially told him to go to hell. And curiously, one can copy the design of the typeface, but not the name. So in response, they copied the typeface and named it Satanic with a K at the end. You probably know that the Troy and the Chaucer typefaces are the same, just one larger than the other. And this is a documented story. Then, with Morris' stated love of early printing, he surprisingly designed and printed pages that did not really look like the old printer's work. There are two reasons for that. Firstly, he has his own idea how to design the page and how to position the printed matter on it, rigidly stating that the inner margin should be narrow, followed by the upper margin, then the lateral margin, with the bottom the largest. This, however, did not apply to all pages, as we can see here. Regarding these rules, he inadvertently changed the meaning of a word in English. If you bought a book on typography in the 1800s, it would be a book about printing in general, presses, paper, type, ink, etc. With Morris, the word in English came to signify what the French appropriately call mise en page, the design and placement of the printed matter on the page. But in every other country, typography has continued to mean printing in the old sense of the word, whether in Argentina or Italy. Consequently, in this country and in England in the 20th century, the word typography came to be limited to the shape of the typeface and the look of the printed page. And this led to hundreds of books on the subject with several individual opinions. And therefore, a new specialist appeared, the typographer, an expert who was ready to tell you what to do with your book, whether you want it or not. And the various opinions were many and varied, mostly grossly exaggerated, like this one. All today's typefaces are trash? Really? And again, whether any typeface is noble or whether it's wiry and hurt the eye is all nonsense. Nobility is not an attribute of a letter. In fact, there are only two aspects of typography that really matter: readability and legibility. Legibility is based on the ease with which one letter can be distinguished from the other. Readability is the ease with which the eye can absorb and enjoy the message and move along the line. In addition to the mise en page, the other reason for the distinguished look of Morris' books was the combination of artwork. He, one of the most accomplished pattern designers, did the borders and initials. Most printers then would hire illustrators for some of the pictures in their books. But Morris had befriended the outstanding artist Burne-Jones in college, and they became fast friends and maintained a close relationship till Morris' death in 1896. Other than one title page by Walter Crane, he did all of the other illustrations for the Kelmscott Press. These two pictures are just amazing, showing them almost 40 years apart, apparently in the same garden. Yet, surprisingly, color was not part of his book vision. His printing was in a dense black color with occasional accents in red. Many other colors were considered by him as effeminate. The only exception that I'm aware of is this book, Love is Enough, where blue is used, a rather pale blue at that. It was printed at the Kelmscott Press, but after Morris' death, so no one knows if he had anything to do with it at all. And a statement should be made at this point. Although Morris never used the term private press, the movement started with him and developed in England, a country the size of Pennsylvania. The movement was a cosmopolitan one, and the people involved knew each other, talked, and wrote about each other. Many of them even lived in close proximity to one another in Hammersmith, where Kelmscott House was located. Emery Walker, Cobden Sanderson, the calligrapher Edward Johnston, who drew the initials for the Dove's Press Bible, and later, briefly, Eric Gill, were all neighbors. I bought this diploma years ago and always wanted to have a calligrapher fill my name in so I would be in the roll of honor in the borough of Hammersmith. Well, it never happened. When the ideas of private press reached this country, it encountered a different environment. A large country with no great tradition of printing, with many cities relatively far from one another, and people who didn't know each other, at least not initially. Morris's influence upon the look of the books was overwhelming. One of the few private presses that used Morris' principles and continued to print in his style was the Elston Press in New York. But others at first did follow Morris' aesthetic, but soon reacted against it. Remember, the starting a private press movement was never Morris's intention. A book of the Marymount Press by Updike would look like this one on the left, but soon changed in time to a more boring look of the one on the right. A similar thing happened to other presses. Here is Gaudi and his Village Press, before and after. Here's the man who said he was going to design a typeface without a K. so no one would misspell his name, spelled with a C, not CK. And staying close to the arts and crafts movement, the press that maintained the highest quality printing and lasted long enough to become the most important in the US was Albert Hubbard's Roycroft. More than just a press, it was a community, and in the book world, this involved printing on handmade paper, binding, illumination, advertisement, and selling. He was a great supporter of women's work and printed a few books by his second wife, Alice. The output was wide and the quality varied, but the best Roycroft publications can be put next to any other and excel in quality of design, printing, and binding. And to compare, how about the elegant, complete writings as opposed to the deteriorating limp leather binding in the center and the scrapbooks, which, by the way, were not printed at the Roycroft. But one can see the quality particularly on those bound by the amazing Louis Kinder, who wrote this book on formulas for bookbinders. Pay attention to the picture on the left. So here is the spectacular bookbinding with that same design on the right. His biography, you see here, on the left was printed by the Bird and Bull Press. And here is my drawing and a photo of the Roycroft Chapel, what printing shops were called all the way back since Caxton printed in Westminster Abbey. The printing shop eventually moved to a larger building, leaving the chapel for bookbinding and illumination. A point should be made that the Roycroft resurrected hand illumination from the Middle Ages, something not very common at that time, but used by the Roycroft Press extensively, from the less expensive productions such as the Little Journeys to the more expensive books. And how do we know they were illuminated without examining the books? Here you can see similar initials with completely different colors, and no printer I know would change the color for every page. Hubbard even allowed the illuminators, mostly women, to draw little miniature illustrations and permitted them to sign their name on many occasions, and no one else was doing that. You can see the signature faintly on the example on the right side. The Roycroft book decorations were very different from Morris's, but still beautiful, especially those done by Dart Hunter. When he left the Roycroft, he became the greatest authority on the history of paper making in the States and elsewhere. Dart Hunter did something that I don't know of any other printer that would equal what he did. He wrote the book, made the paper, designed the typeface, made the punches and cast the type, then set the type and printed it himself. Pretty unique. And here's something you won't see anyplace else. When you joined the Roycroft, you were given a stock in the company, but you had to sell it when you left. So this is Dart Hunter's own stock. On the other side, you see the signed document returning the stock to Hubbard II after his father's death on the Lusitania. And notice there the typo. It is interesting to point out that the English private presses were not very challenging concerning the subject matter. They printed established titles like Dante's Commedia, the Bible, the Book of Common Prayer, and of course the Chaucer. On the other hand, the Roycroft published shocking books like the sexually explicit and erotic Solomon's Song of Songs, Oscar Wilde's Ballad of Reading Gaol, and De Quincey's Confession of an English Opium Eater, among others, and these were considered definitely very controversial at that time. And how about this? Essays on Socialism, including Morris, Bernard Shaw, Edward Carpenter, printed by the Roycroft in 1898 on the so-called Kelmscott paper. No private press was doing this in England or in the States. Then the collectors wanted to know exactly what a private press was, so to satisfy their curiosity, many books were written about private presses in general, and these are only a few that I pulled out. The authors don't always agree on exactly what a private press is or was, but that didn't stop them from creating many definitions. In addition to all that was said, the main goals and the reaches have changed significantly since the turn of the last century. No current press has a desire to change commercial printing as they did then. There was even a periodical dedicated entirely to the subject. You have to wonder if there really is that much to talk about and argue. I always assumed that book collecting was one of the main reasons I became interested in printing. Many printers started as book collectors, and Morris was no exception. I collected jazz books for many years. But when I began to realize after a certain point that I was buying only the recently published books, as I had collected most of the old ones, I decided to donate the entire collection to the jazz department at UCLA. They already had a good ephemera collection donated by Ella Fitzgerald and a large number of records donated by Leonard Feather, the jazz critic. By that time, I had joined a book collectors club in LA, the Zamorano Club, and simultaneously became more and more interested in the arts and crafts movement. By the way, Agustin Zamorano was the first printer in California. And here is the infamous group with me there on the left. This was not photoshopped. There is evidence that I was younger then. But it was primarily in talking multiple times with Peter High, owner of the original Book Alley in Pasadena, that the printing idea began to materialize. He got together the initial group, Karl Heinz, who was teaching graphic arts at UCLA at that time, Helen Driscoll, and later her husband Scott, owners of Fine Paper Company in Pasadena, and of course, providing all the support, my wife Ann. And here's Peter and I, during his most recent visit, 25 years after inspiring the formation of the press. The question then came up regarding the name of the press, as the other members did their own thing. I was fortunate enough to be living in the Duncan Irwin house, designed by Green & Green Architects, who were famous, among other things, for using the over-fired and slightly deformed bricks called Clinker bricks. The presses had been placed in the garage since the accordion doors never worked well to put the cars in. And I didn't want any highfalutin names such as the Gutenberg Press, the Royal Press, the Caxton Press. And since the garage was made of clinker bricks, and a clinker was something of no importance, the Clinker Press was named and remains the name to this day. And two other people were absolutely necessary for a clinker press to exist and keep clinking, since I didn't know how to print. First and foremost, Regis Graydon. He was a professional printer and later established his private press. We were both members of the Zamorano Club. His press was called Nut Quad Press, named for what we call the N space. He did have a sense of humor. In fact, press names are often very funny. I certainly wouldn't want to work at the Limberlost Press. I want to keep all my limbers. Regis would say, "You want to print? Just put ink on the form and squeeze it hard." "Oh, you want to print well? That's another matter." And then he patiently taught me the print a little bit at a time. The other person was Bob Paduano. He was a machine repairman, but over the years became a real friend. He would often call me saying a printing shop was going out of business and would invite me to come and see the letterpress items. And that's how I acquired most of what I have. And he was very influential in moving the presses in Pasadena and then from there to Oregon twice. What you see here are two flatbed trucks that were used to bring the shop to Portland, and on the right, Bob driving the forklift. As you have probably realized by now, I have many misgivings about typography, artist books, and what is called, without definition, fine printing. As I've said, typography is really just opinions and common sense recommendations, but it can never become a science. As an example, here's the same Updike arguing that 4 consecutive hyphens may be better than increasing the word space in order to justify a line. Need I repeat? an opinion. And look at this example. The book on the left on my shelf at home always read Crashby. I thought I could perhaps rearrange the C and R and it would make it better. It makes sense, but again, just an opinion. I'll just mention a few examples of typography since there is so much to say about the subject and I don't want to keep you here all night. This was a periodical called The Artsman, printed for the Rose Valley community in the early 1900s by Horace Trouble. He decided that if the last word of the paragraph ended there, the next paragraph should be just under it. Well, an opinion. Another example is the poet E. E. Cummings, who had his own idea about the typography of his poetry. And who is going to say he's wrong? He was the poet, and he knew the look he wanted of his poem on the page. Finally, a printer from Pasadena that I knew, Vince Gary of Weatherbird Press, he was very shy, and his printing reflected his personality. He printed a gray-black. Perfect. In fact, a subject that I like to talk about is how writers so rarely have an opinion on typography other than illustrations. Here's an interesting early example. Luther's Psalms. He wanted wide margins on the side and the bottom of the page, not for the design look, but so people could write their thoughts as they read them. It looks a little odd, but it served the purpose. And just to provoke the typographers out there, I wonder what the right thing is when using an emoji, punctuation before or after the emoji. Just asking. But remember that Morris' main point in arranging type was that he wanted the space between words to be very tight, but that frequently ended up confusing for the reader. This is an example of the work of the well-known Grabhorn Press following his rule on word spacing. But typography is a means to communicate something written. There's nothing controversial about that. Years ago, I was invited to participate in a typography group and then found out that none of the participants were printers. When they asked me to bring a good example of typography, I brought this. This is the verso page of a drug ad showing its many side effects and contraindications. If I was hired by a pharmaceutical company as a typographer, I would choose exactly this. Light color ink on blue paper, 6-point sans serif, all capitals. Why? That's very difficult to read, and that's exactly what they want. Then in the mid-30s, Beatrice Ward, a well-known typographer in England, wrote an essay entitled Printing Should Be Invisible. What she meant was that the printer should not add anything that would interfere with the text. The metaphor became known as the crystal goblet, implying that, like the wine glass that doesn't interfere with the color of the wine, printing should be transparent, no interference with the text. Had she been living today, this would be what printing on demand does. Nothing. No concept of aesthetics. I wrote and printed a reprisal because what she said goes against all principles of design as it applies to private presses. Design is necessary, especially as something that makes a person pick up one book to read and not the other. This is printing to enhance the pleasure of reading and then of having the object. Of course, I agree that sometimes printing is only for the usefulness of the content. So here is my first edition of Johnson's dictionary, which he compiled himself, and it took him 7 years to complete. The current private press printer encounters some problems that we have to face and deal with. The first is the printing of Aunt Julia's poetry. Maybe not the best, but hey, we all have some Aunt Julia in the closet, and many private press printers are sometimes persuaded to print their poetry. Ward Ritchie, a well-known Southern California printer, printed this little-known author, and I thought, no, I would never do that. But even Morris did it. He printed the poetry of Wilfrid Blunt, a mediocre poet, even before he printed his own book of poetry. Most likely this was because his wife, Jane Morris, was in love with Blunt. Did I say I would never do that? But then it happened that a good friend lost her husband, and soon thereafter the epidemic started. She wrote these beautiful short poems, many of them. Eventually I had them edited and printed them for her. Never say never, you know the principle. The other is based on a story about the Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges. His vision was never good, but he was essentially blind later in life and always had someone helping him. The doorbell rang and his assistant answered and said, "It's a present for you, Mr. Borges. Let's see what it is." "Oh, it's a book. It's in a crocodile skin clamshell box with ties. Oh, the book is bound in full leather with gold stamping. Oh, inside it says it's a limited edition hand printed on handmade paper, and the type was set by hand and bound." And Borges replied, "Well, this is not a book, it's a box of chocolates." And again I said, I wouldn't do that. I would never print a box of chocolates. But then a good friend, Tom Herman, of Seven Finger Jewelry, saw a book I had printed called Two Red Roses Across the Moon by Morris. He loved the decorations and wanted to make a piece of jewelry to go along with the book. We did 15 and placed them in clamshell boxes for sale. My first box of chocolates. We eventually did more with the same principle. I would design the page, send him the graphics, out of which he would make a brooch. Over the years we made one for the Raven, this one on the poetry of Dante Gabriel Rossetti with drawings from his various paintings, the three haiku masters with a silk cover, illustrations with very tight registration on handmade paper, this one on wine poetry, the poetry of the early modern period, and this one on the Yosemite, a piece by John Muir, and finally a prose version of the Song of Myself, much more interesting to read as a prose since the poetry itself was free verse. But most of my books, however, are not boxes of chocolates. Although I do focus my attention on the arts and crafts movement, many books fall outside that range. For instance, I printed a portfolio of Sam Kleiberger's erotic drawings. He was an amazing artist and taught at Otis Art Institute in LA for many years. The portfolio is not that big, it's just the combined image that made it so. It included an essay by Paul Kallstrom on the status of the model in the studio, but this is seen from the model's standpoint. It's a very interesting point of view. I essentially took the original drawings and made plates from which the images were printed letterpress. I have always admired the Grand Inquisitor chapter of Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky, and here I printed a version with an original translation by Boris Dreliuk and an original illustration by Vladimir Zimakov. And here is the illustration in gray and black. And here is the title page showing that this is a new translation. The original translation by Constance Garnett made him sound like a Victorian writer, according to Boris. I recently printed a small bio of Beardsley by his editor Arthur Symons at the Savoy after he left the Yellow Book. The book is full of my copying of some of his drawings, isolating the figure and often completing the drawing if interrupted by the margins originally. I even tried my hand at hand typesetting 8-point Baskerville on this poem on the needle's excellency. Typesetting 8-point is not recommended. It's entitled The Praise of the Needle. It was a poem by the so-called water poet John Taylor. But I have printed about 30 books and many other pamphlets. And here is evidence that I don't entirely ignore typography in the 20th century meaning of the word. Here are 3 interesting essays on the subject. Will Bradley never answered the question of whether printing is an art. Printing was a trade. and if it is an art at all, it is an art that serves other arts. Paraphrasing Cleveland. Another thing that I really like to do is broadsides, like small posters, following the design elements common in the arts and crafts era of flattening of the image, simplification of design and color. And I have done hundreds of these. This particular group of 15 prints I called Redesigning the Designers. In each, you can see the original designer, but that particular one didn't exist until I redesigned and printed them. Then I printed this portfolio of the many faces of Morris, using as illustration 5 different views of Kelmscott Manor from pictures that I took last time I was there visiting. To print this poem of Henley, I redrew all these letters one by one so they would be crisp and clear when printed letterpress. I presented it to the Double Crown Club in London when I was invited to speak to them. This one I printed long ago with this quote I came up with, which is even more valid today. Books don't always please. They shouldn't. Minds don't always conform. They mustn't. Finally, this is something I did for the Arts and Crafts Textile Design Show my wife curated for the Pasadena Museum of History, as it was called at that time. Then I printed a book of her essay on the subject. Then one day I bought this woodblock page, not knowing what it was about. I eventually pulled a proof and had someone who read Japanese look at it. It turned out to be 2 pages of the Analects of Confucius. Not bad. Abe Lerner gave a lecture to the Double Crown Club entitled Assault on the Book, and in a few phrases defined almost precisely what the Clinker press stands for. Quote, "The basic function of printing is to provide reading matter to enable the writer to talk to the reader. Everything else in printing is secondary. Some secondary aspects can provide other pleasures, such as making the book attractive or even beautiful, but they defeat the purpose of the book if they introduce features that impede the flow of the author's thoughts to the reader." End quote. Therefore, no accordion books will be found at the press. Accordions interfere with reading. So, eventually, I have to address the question of why I print, as there's no outside pressure for the formation of an individual private press. My father used to say that life is not a sprint, but a long-distance run. I find a similar connection to printing. There is a long curve to learning how to print well, but all along you are printing and learning from mistakes. The print on the press says something we have to have in mind. A press does not know if the author is a genius or a charlatan. And then you gotta love the process. I try to stay away from words like my passion, my art, or destiny, but the love of creating a version of literature with well cared for machinery, careful planning of the project, and attention to the process all have to be there. I believe I spend at least 30% of my reading considering texts that are worth printing, as you can't extract sunbeams from cucumbers. Obviously, I have to like the text. The size of the edition has to be within my capabilities and the capability of my presses. Then there is an intimacy with the text that is achieved to a degree by the typesetting of the words written by the author. A certain way of understanding what has been written by the fact that typesetting is much slower than reading. Of course, there is no understanding of Finnegan's Wake, no matter how slowly you typeset it. And some kind of Bill of Rights is necessary for private presses to focus on the message and avoid derogatory criticisms that what we do is artificially rarefied and deliberately beautified. Or, even worse, as Holbrook Jackson said about Morris, that the Kelmscott books must remain museum pieces, typographical monuments, beautiful and ineffectual angels, beating in the void their luminous wings in vain. Ouch! I also sense an obligation to do justice to the author and the text, so the design has to be considered in terms of typeface, paper, color, and eventually illustrations, but not always in that order. I have even been asked occasionally about the zen of typesetting, and I have to reply there is no such a thing. You have to pay attention all the time for fear that the dreaded typo will insert itself in your composition. Then, once the typesetting is complete and the book printed, I still don't have a book. I have to choose the end papers, the material and the color of the cover, and have to send it to the binder. And only then do I see the completed book, and it is exciting. And finally, there are some nice side effects. People will pay money to have your books, and I find my books in the most unusual places, and libraries will ask for copies for their special collections. Mine are at the University of Oregon in Eugene, and here I am with David DeLorenzo at the time of the donation. More recently, while visiting the Museum of Arts and Crafts movement in St. Petersburg, Florida, I saw 4 of my jewelry books there for sale. And then, just to find the title of my lecture, I bought a copy of William Morris's John Ball, about the peasant revolution in England in the 1300s, and I found the speech to be the most important part. Therefore, I reprinted the speech of John Ball and had a slipcase where I housed the two. If not rubbing shoulders, I was at least rubbing spines with the man. And then, to my surprise, Robert Coop, a Morris expert who wrote about his illustrated editions and happened to collect Clinker Press, decided to donate his Morris collection to Simon Fraser University in British Columbia. When I went to visit him, he took me to see the special collections. And there he was, my Clinker Press book, shoulder to shoulder with much Morris material. He made all the difference in the world to me. And thank you very much for your attention. Well, welcome to the Clinker Press. It sometimes surprises me that I've been printing for over 25 years, and of recent, I was lucky to find this property and be able to build this printing shop that I visit almost every day. As you enter the printing shop, what you see is essentially what would have been a printing shop in the 50s, perhaps 60s, things that were necessary for commercial work, and private presses would have been provided with similar presses and similar type cases and so on. So I'll go over some of the specific items that I have here. So first and foremost, the Albion press. This press is essentially the same that Morris used. Albion was made by several manufacturers. This one, as you can see, is from 1876. It is not much different from what was used initially. Of course, I hate to say the Gutenberg press because no one knows what the Gutenberg press looked like. But essentially, the pressure up and down. The two primary differences are no longer a screw mechanism, but this lever type mechanism that allows you to put a pressure on the press, and you have better control and less force necessary to produce the print. The other is the fact that it is made out of cast metal and has less give than the original wood press. Essentially, the form would be here and the paper here. This is something to protect the paper that you don't want to print. You bring this down, go under the press, and squeeze it. And this is the beautiful thing about the hand press is that you can control the pressure that you apply so that you don't overprint or underprint. A etching press was occasionally seen in printing shops. I don't do as much etching, but I'm capable to decorate a book that requires it. And here is the plate that is used for that. Now remember that this is not letterpress. In other words, what is to be printed is into the grooves. So the mechanism is to apply the ink, wipe off the ink, so the ink that stays in there stays in the crevices of the original design. And then with this very high pressure machine and with blankets, you use dampened paper to almost kind of bite into it and grab the ink that is in the plate so you can reproduce very fine lines. If you want to print a pamphlet, this is what you need. This is misleadingly called a stitcher, but it's not a stitch. It really is a staple. But because of the plate that you have there, which is V-shaped, I can't get a good view of it, you lay down the booklet and it will staple right in the spine. And every printing shop has to have one of these accurate saws. This saw is increased or decreased by point size by turning this. It is absolutely square and necessary if you want to fit in something between the type. And of course, type is something that you have to have, even if you have other means by which you can print. It is easy enough to drop an initial or add something at the last minute, as type is easy to maneuver, but not for books. For books, it's very hard to get, first of all, enough type to do the whole page, as well as the control of each type, the alignment, and so on. An interesting story, as I am a collector, and of course dealers know who you are. I was called on the phone and I was told that they had a stool with the mark Roycroft that you can see here. And the guy said, I'm not really understanding this. The stool is relatively high. And I said, I know exactly what it is a typesetting stool. It is high enough that you can put the case on top and still have the height correct for handset typing. And this is a Coats Armory press, a snapper like they call it, but very accurate and good for job printing. Here is a milli vertical press. This is an automatic cylinder press, well liked by the industry because of the small space it occupies compared to the larger Heidelberg cylinder press. And here are the two Vandercook presses. These are wonderful to print multiple colors, as you can keep the basic block in one and just add the color in the other. And always check for registration. Considering the Coats Armory press, one thing that is very different from the Chandler and Price press is as the impression happens by decreasing that angle, at the very end, the platen goes straight into the form, and this allows us to print to the very width of the platen. The Intertype machine is the machine that allows me to print books more easily. The Linotype, the competitor, was called by Edison as the seventh wonder of the world. It is a very complex machine with 1,500 moving parts, and it is made up of the pot that has the molten lead, antimony, and tin. The magazines containing this particular typeface, and it is a matrix. It has a key mechanism that enables it to go back into place, and you will see that in the video. An unusual keyboard that you get used to it. And as you press the keys, the matrices will drop into that little area, and I will raise that first elevator. It goes off to the side, down, and the pot that is hot, is not on right now, will have a plunger that will push in, and it will drop the line in this tray. The matrices will go up to the second elevator that will come down from the top and then take it to this kind of corkscrew mechanism, and each individual matrix will drop back in place, and you're ready for the next line. Let's say I'm going to say Ruskin Club. And this is a space band. It is wedge shaped so that it goes up and tightens the line so there's no spill. Say from Los Angeles. All right. The Ludlow machine is similar to the Intertype Linotype, except that it is set by hand but still casts a line of type. I'll show you how it's done. So essentially, you'll have a stick where you're going to set your line here. These are the upper cases and lower cases. Let's just set my name, and you just pull out the letters, and after the first, you put a space in to go to the next one, and there you go. So you have essentially what you want to set here. You can read it to make sure that it's correct, and then we go to the machine. Again, the machine is not on, but you essentially lock it in position, and here is the plunger. The plunger will push down, the lead will come up, form the line, and it'll drop here so you can see what it is that you set. And of course, you have to have type sticks. The type stick is where you set hand type, and it has an attachment here that varies the length of the line. And it's interesting because this is different from another collection of type sticks that I have here, which essentially are locked in one position, as this one here. It's because that's the size of a newspaper column. So these are called pica sticks. The things that I have on the wall, of course, this is a not well preserved linotype achievement milestones showing the various machines up to 1936. Right next to it is a poster by Denslow about the Rycroft. You remember my showing that large sign of the Kelmscott, William Morris, some pictures of me printing. This is Saint Bridget. She is the patron saint of printers. And various other prints on the wall. And here there's something interesting that the light makes it difficult to show. But this is called a flong. It is how newspapers used to be printed. They would set the page and put a sort of a papier mâché on top, make an impression, and then put another layer of lead. So this is all one entire block of metal from this flong, and that can be wrapped around a cylinder machine, making it easier to print. And various and sundry things, all related to printing or printed by me. The final thing to say is, how do I make blocks with multiple colors? Well, there is this item called photopolymer, where this whole surface is one size, all even, and the material is water soluble. But if you have a drawing, you make into a negative, and the negative is put on top of this. So where the ultraviolet light penetrates, it polymerizes the material. Then you wash it off, so whatever is not polymerized will wash off. And here is something that is now type high if you put on top of this very powerful magnet. So this is the same height as a letter, this one from the Ludlow. And this way you can print one color and then come back and print the other colors. So this is the visit to the printing shop that I promised. Obviously, you can always come over and visit personally. There are many other things that can be discussed and shown that I don't have the time to do at this point. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Andre. It's delightful to have you effectively in person, even if virtually in person, to have you live in a sense. So let's just open it up as we always do after, especially after a presentation as varied and rich as this one, to questions, comments, things that people would like to bring up. One of them has come through chat, Andre, on how is maintenance done on these older machines. Obviously, it's hard to find with someone with that expertise.
Yes, of course it is. And very interesting because there is this one guy, Dave Seats. He lives in Tennessee. And every year, or sometimes twice a year, he would announce to people who have these machines, say, I am going around the country. He literally goes around the country in his pickup truck with various parts that he carries along, and you schedule him. He is scheduled to come see me at the end of the month. Initially, he'll say May, June, but then you'll say, no, it's going to be May, or it's going to be the first week as it gets closer. And he comes around and he is amazing. He knows these machines back and forth, and he'll come, and fixing a machine sometimes is easier than adjusting the machine. Make it just do everything it's supposed to do just perfectly right. But he is getting older, and we don't know who is going to come up and be able to help. There is a guy in LA that I have had to pay his ticket up here one day when Dave was not around and was not coming anytime soon. And he did come up. He stayed with us for a day and fixed the machine. Next day, he was back in LA.
The other comment is that we learn too as we go along. I can fix a lot more on that, particularly the inner type, than I could, say, 10 years ago. You learn as you go along.
Anyone
Any other?
else? Don't be shy.
Well, I just would like to tell Andre, this is Larry Kreisman in Seattle. This was wonderful. This was brilliant. I've never heard you do this whole history talk and such creative use of visuals that I am envious of you because my lectures are not that clever. But Andre, it's just a pleasure to see that and to hear from you and also to appreciate the few rare books that I have in our library from you, and thinking now that maybe they belong at the University of Washington in the rare book room, but I haven't yet been ready to part with them. So thank you, Andre.
But of course, you are a friend, so we have to take that in consideration. But thank you for liking my books and having some of the books, and we can talk books in the future.
Yeah.
Any other provoking comments? Well, the thing that no one has raised is the inclusion of Roycroft as a typical private press in this country. Not everybody agrees with it. And a little bit is because they produce so much. In fact, when I was with David DeLorenzo at University of Oregon, he says, "Oh, Andre, we have everything that the Roycroft printed." I didn't say anything, but it was, "No, you don't. There is so much that they published, and that they published different versions and this and that. In the end, after Hubbard's death, they printed little stuff, like the Aunt Julia poetry kind of thing. But there it is, a Roycroft publication, and it's an enormous thing. But just recently, there was an auction of for two collectors who died and put their books at auction. And these beautiful bound books were going for, $5,000, $6,000. Kelmscott Press books, are around that price, other than the Chaucer, of course. So some people who are book collectors would argue with me about raising the Roycroft at that level, but I believe there is a point in saying, bring these books, let's look at these books. Are they worth consideration among the best of the other private presses? And I think they are.
Yeah. Yeah, Andre, I have a small collection of an assortment of Roycroft publications. And as you pointed out, one of the great things about Roycroft is just the range of it.
Mhm.
You have these simple books, the little journeys booklets, and then you have these deluxe editions of Hubbard's writings. The writings are not so deluxe, but they have their limitations. But the bindings are just, and the illumination is just extraordinary.
Yes. And you mentioned the little journeys. And I think being someone so much into selling, that term was wrong. You shouldn't have called little journeys. They are small biographies.
Right.
And how many? 170. Go write 170, even small biographies without the internet. And he went to Europe, collected a whole bunch of data to bring back, but 170 biographies. That's amazing.
Yeah.
And they were published and republished and republished, and it went on and on and on. And he found a company to print very early on, 1895. They began to print the little journeys. And through the 20s, they were still being reprinted.
No. Well, you also mentioned the hand coloring, which in so many of the Roycroft volumes is just so winsome and original.
And again, that was not done. You go to Village Press, all of these other presses, they would say, yeah, no, hand coloring, no. But that's what we like in medieval hand illuminated books. We think they're wonderful.
Isn't there also a lot of criticism of Roycroft? Isn't it that he never actually went to? I don't know whether that's settled. Whether he actually never went to see Morris, and also those bindings where the red comes off in one's hand.
Yes, but the first item is a very interesting thing because I have read quite a lot about it. The ones who criticized said he never saw Morris. And it could be. Morris was not someone that you approached that easily, and maybe he wasn't in a mood or whatever. But the fact is, traveling to England was not a little thing, but he did take the boat, travel to England. He did go to Kelmscott House because he met McHale, who was eventually his secretary. So he visited the press. Whether he saw Morris or not, I think is less important. So if he did or if he didn't, the point was to see what a private press was, how Morris was running his private press, much less than, hello, how are you, Morris? That was less important, but he did go there. He did find out about it, came back, and there is a little journey to William Morris, and it's fascinating to me because it does not mention the arts and crafts movement. It doesn't mention. It's only about writing and printing, which is what he wanted to do initially. He had 3 books printed before he started the Roycroft. So he wanted to be a writer. When he worked very briefly for a newspaper in Chicago, he was like 18, 19 years old, and he wrote a couple of pieces that were printed in the newspaper. But the limp leather was probably something very nice at the time when new, it was a chamois, but no one realized that it was going to deteriorate in time because it overlaps the book itself. Then how do you keep it? Well, you have to keep it flat. If you keep it straight, then it will eventually wear out, and it was not a good idea. But perhaps at the time, no one knew that was going to be so bad.
Andre, some of the literature says during that visit where it claims that he saw Morris, also claims that he saw Ruskin. I've never seen anything documented that would indicate that that was true.
I have never either. And again, it's a conversation of it, whether Ruskin was important for what he was doing here. Again, remember at that time, his whole focus was on printing. The whole thing about the community, which would have been more a Ruskin type of thing.
Yes.
Later, but the history goes like this, and I won't remember the precise years, but he starts printing some of his books with Tabor, who was a local East Aurora printer. It was no good, and that printing was horrible. That's the print that the ink comes off, the registration is not right, and eventually he was running in trouble financially. Then Hubbard buys him out, and the name of his press was Roycroft Press before Hubbard. So he got the name when he bought the printing shop. Then he goes to his house and puts the press in the basement. In that house, he has a couple of rooms, one of them named William Morris and one named Ruskin. So fairly early, he was, looking at Morris, at Ruskin. But for the initial push to write and publish these things, I think it was more Morris.
Yeah. it would be interesting to know, I think, not impossible, but highly unlikely that he saw Ruskin, particularly because of the period. You know, Ruskin was largely in seclusion in the 1890s, and certainly by 1898, Ruskin was very close to death, and so that it would have been very unlikely that he would be seeing visitors. But you know, but it's possible again that Hubbard saw the some of the Guild of St. George projects, some of the agrarian projects that the Guild was doing under Ruskin's direction, the Totley Communists, for example. But it would be interesting. It would be interesting to trace that visit.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think the point to make is he didn't go to England looking for something to write, which would have been a Ruskin connection. He knew what he wanted to write. He went to understand what the printing, private press didn't exist as a name, as a term at that time, but he went to see what Morris was doing. But he wouldn't be looking for Ruskin's idea on what to print, although he did print some Ruskin later on.
Mm-hmm.
That would have been interesting. But I think I agree with you. Ruskin would have been a much more difficult person to visit at that time, at the end of his life. He died 1900, right?
Right.
I have a question, and thank you so much, Andre. It was really an amazing tour and story, and I want to come visit in person.
Please come.
My question is about Ashby, who I always feel, I appreciate that you brought him up a couple times, and he feels like a living link between what Morris is doing and what's happening on this continent. And I wondered if you could just talk briefly about Ashby and the Kelmscott Press when it closed, and kind of what was his vision in the Essex House Press.
Well, as you know, he bought most of the presses that belonged to the Kelmscott. It went to Essex House initially. Ashby is a more difficult person to kind of say, this is what he's about. His thing was not so much personal. I'm not sure how much direct impact he had on the Essex House publications, because he wanted to have people do things. All of his idea of moving to the Cotswold with his silversmithing thing, which was a bad idea. He had his customers in London. When he moved to Cotswold, very quickly he went out of business. But he was the group. Fun, if I could kind of come up with pictures, the picture of all his group exercising. It's a picture that you see around, but he was much more into the group thing. Morris would use the printers and so on, but it's his thing. Essex House was not so much just his thing. He did want the community to participate in it. And I'm not sure exactly, for instance, who designed all the Essex House books. The one that I mentioned there, the book on Common Prayer, is a beautiful, large book, and it's bound in wood boards, just gorgeous stuff. But nowhere do you see the Roycroft signature of who designed this. And it's much more, there's so much more to search to find out exactly who did the Essex House Press books. But good question. Maybe I will investigate.
Thank you.
Anything else? Yeah, the thing about the Roycroft is that he was, you know, flamboyant and so on, but then all the time you see this, he was a soap salesman. Wrong. He did work for a small company as a salesman for the company. But again, John Larkin was his brother-in-law. When he hired Hubbard, he hired for the selling department. And I may have it here. I have a stock of the Larkin Company that belongs to someone else. And there is his signature there as a secretary. Because without that knowledge, he was not a door-to-door salesman, he was in the selling department. How could he, having worked there for 10 years or so, accumulate $75,000, which is what he took out of the Larkin Company when he left? You don't do that as a soap salesman from door to door. So this is something that is a derogatory comment that is made about Hubbard that I am always upset about it.
Of course, it's a wonderful touch that Ashby came to California.
Charles Green. There's a big meeting at the Charles Green. Actually, his house was almost next to the Duncan Irwin house where we're living. And yeah, and they admired each other. There was a good connection there. I'm surprised that he never went to the Roycroft. I'm surprised that the Roycroft didn't have any connection with Stickley, just down the road a bit. He's in Syracuse, it's just down the road. There's no evidence of connection. And recently I found some letters from Trouble from
Rose Valley.
Yeah, Rose Valley, but from, I think they're all from him to Hubbard. So we don't know exactly, but there was some conversation there, but not with Stickley, and someone like Ashby, who is so involved in the community and not having visited the Roycroft is all interesting by its absence. Anything else?
Great, thank you, Andre, for this comprehensive tour through the really unique tour through the history of the private press movement and of your own work as a printer. I'd also like to thank Joseph Rodriguez, our technical assistant, for his advice in preparing this program and for his help tonight. For those of you interested, I hope you're all interested, we'll be posting this soon on the Ruskin Art Club YouTube channel. So it will be up within the next week or so, joining the almost 90 other archived talks and presentations that are on our site. Upcoming events. For those of you who live in Southern California, please look for us at the annual Los Angeles Times Festival of Books at the University of Southern California, April 20th to 21st, all day, both days. The Ruskin Art Club has a booth this year, and we look forward to greeting you in person. Next month, we've been able to secure the services of a major UK-based writer on art and its impact on human life, Laura Cumming, the author of the widely acclaimed study Thunderclap, a memoir of art and life and sudden death. Her lecture will be moderated by our own Sarah Atwood. That will be on Saturday, May 18th, 9 through 10:30 a.m. Pacific Daylight Time on Zoom, of course. Laura will be speaking to us from the UK. Note too that Sarah Atwood will be leading our members only study group on Ruskin Saturday, May 4th. If also 10 to 11:30 on the Ruskin's lecture on Queen's Gardens, and the details are all on the will be on the website. and membership application forms. We've made joining the Ruskin Art Club easier than ever. Also, I'd like to note that we have a new venture, the Ruskin Today podcast, which we've just launched. We have a interview with the Dean of Ruskin Scholars, Robert Hewison, and a new interview with the American Ruskin Scholar, Jim Spates. So please visit our website and look for the podcast tab. Thank you all for being with us tonight. And until next time, as we all dare, as Ruskin urges, to be souls that live with their eyes open. Good night.
Thank you. Night.
Andre, terrific.
Thank you. Thank you. So Joseph's father is Brazilian?
É, carioca.
Carioca.
Uhum.
Como eu.
Ah, isso é que eu pensei, né? Um
Ótimo.
brasileiro que volta por Miami, volta para o Brasil, pensa, é carioca.
Não deixa de ser carioca.
Que bom. Foi um grande prazer, senhor.
Aqui também. Grande abraço.
Tá.
Tchau.
Igual. Tchau.
Thank you.
Andre, again, wonderful tonight.
Thank you.